I stood there in our family living room, watching as my carefully constructed world crumbled around me. The Christmas tree lights cast dancing shadows on the walls, but the warmth they usually brought was gone. My sister Sarah's words still hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Emily's a millionaire. She built her own company, Elysian Relics. It's worth over $18 million. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as my parents' expressions transformed from shock to something else entirely. A look I'd seen before, but never quite this raw. Expectation. Mom's hand trembled as she set down her coffee mug, and Dad's glasses fogged up slightly as he leaned forward in his favorite armchair, the one I'd secretly paid to have reupholstered last spring. "Is this true, Emily?" Mom's voice quivered, but not with pride. Her eyes had taken on that calculating look I'd grown to dread over the years. The same look she'd had when she'd send me to Grandma's house every time Sarah had so much as sneezed. I smoothed down my silk blouse, a small luxury I'd allowed myself after my company's first major success, and took a deep breath. "Yes," I said simply. What else could I say? That I'd been secretly supporting them for years. That every time Sarah dropped out of another college program, it was my money that cushioned her fall. "Why didn't you tell us?" Dad's voice cracked with what I initially thought was emotion, but then he continued. "We've been struggling with the mortgage. Sarah needs tuition for her new design program. I've been wanting to start a business." The words hit me like physical blows. Not congratulations. Not, "We're proud of you." Just a shopping list of needs and wants, as if I were an ATM they'd just discovered in their living room. Sarah, my baby sister who I'd watched being coddled and protected all her life, jumped in eagerly. "Emmy, you could help me start my own interior design studio. I have so many ideas, and with your money—" "My money," I interrupted, the words tasting foreign on my tongue. In all these years of success, I'd never said those words out loud to my family. The money I earned, by myself. Mom's face hardened, a look I recognized from my childhood, the one that preceded sending me away for Sarah's safety. "Emily, don't be selfish. We're family. We've always taken care of each other." I almost laughed at that. Always taken care of each other? Where was that care when I was 8, suddenly pushed aside because Sarah needed more attention? Where was it during my high school graduation when they couldn't attend because Sarah had a slight fever? Where was it when I worked my way through college, taking double shifts at cafes while building my knowledge of antiquities, standing there, surrounded by the ghosts of my childhood and the weight of unmet expectations? I felt something shift inside me. The invisible thread that had kept me tethered to their approval, their validation, suddenly snapped. For the first time, I saw clearly what I had been too afraid to acknowledge all these years. I had built my success not because of them, but in spite of them. And now, they wanted to claim it as their due. Growing up in our modest home in Minnesota, I used to believe that simplicity meant happiness. My earliest memories are tinged with the golden hue of contentment. Helping Dad set up his rickety fishing gear by the lake on weekends, watching Mom's tired smile as she returned from her night shift at the hospital, still in her crisp white uniform. We weren't rich, but we had enough. Enough love, enough laughter, enough of everything that mattered. I can still smell the sweet, tart scent of the wild berries Dad and I would pick on our way home from fishing, feel the sticky warmth of ice cream dripping down my fingers during those endless summer evenings on our creaky porch swing. Mom would join us after her nap, her nurse's hands gentle as she braided my hair, telling me stories about her patients while Dad graded physics, papers at the kitchen table. Our house wasn't fancy, just a simple 2-story with faded blue siding and windows that rattled when the Minnesota winds blew too hard. But it was home. My bedroom, with its hand-me-down furniture and walls covered in my drawings, was my sanctuary. I'd spend hours there, reading about ancient civilizations and art history, dreaming of the treasures hidden in far-off places. Then Sarah came along. I was 8 when Mom's pregnancy was announced. Old enough to understand the concept of having a sibling, but too young to grasp how completely my world would shift. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Mom had to quit her night shifts, and suddenly our comfortable routine began to crack. I watched as my parents' faces grew more worried with each doctor's visit. Sarah arrived 2 months early, tiny and fragile as a baby bird. The day they brought her home, everything changed. My colorful, warm home transformed into a sterile environment that smelled perpetually of disinfectant. The sound of laughter was replaced by the whir of air purifiers and the beeping of medical monitors. "Emmy, you need to stay at Grandma's for a while," Mom said one day, packing my small suitcase. "Sarah's immune system is very weak, and we can't risk her getting sick." I remember standing in Grandma's guest room that first night, clutching my favorite stuffed elephant, wondering what I had done wrong. Was I too loud? Too messy? Too much of a risk to my sister's health? The visits to Grandma's became more frequent, stretching from days to weeks. Each time I returned home, I felt more like a visitor in my own house. The fishing trips with Dad stopped. The ice cream evenings disappeared. My art supplies were packed away because the smell of paint might irritate Sarah's lungs. Even my birthday celebrations became quiet, subdued affairs, always with the caveat, we can't excite Sarah too much. I learned to move quietly through our house, to make myself small and unobtrusive. I became an expert at reading my parents' expressions, knowing when to retreat to my room before Sarah needed attention. My good grades and achievements at school were met with distracted nods and hurried, "That's nice, honey," responses, usually followed by, "Sarah needs her medicine now," or, "Could you please be quieter? Sarah's trying to sleep." Looking back now, I realize that's when I started building my invisible walls, creating a world within myself where I didn't need their attention or approval. I became my own cheerleader, my own support system. Every accomplishment, every small victory, I celebrated alone in my room, whispering congratulations to myself in the dark. My teenage years weren't marked by typical rebellion. Instead, they were defined by a quiet determination to become invisible. The Sugar Pines Bakery became my sanctuary, a place where the warm scent of fresh bread and the gentle hum of conversation replaced the sterile silence of home. There, for the first time since Sarah's birth, I felt seen. "You have an eye for detail, Emily," Mrs. Martinez, the owner, would say as I arranged the display cases, making sure each pastry caught the morning light perfectly. She noticed things my parents never did. How I could tell when the bread was done just by its smell. How I organized the vintage cake stands by era and style. How customers smiled more when I helped them choose their purchases. At home, a different drama was unfolding. Sarah, now in elementary school, had become the sun around which our family orbited. Her health had improved, but the pattern of preferential treatment had become deeply ingrained. I watched as my parents poured everything into her, time, money, attention, while I faded further into the background. "Emily, we need you to give Sarah your college fund," Mom announced one evening, not even looking up from her phone. Her medical bills from last month were higher than expected. I stood at the kitchen counter, my acceptance letter to Northwestern University burning a hole in my backpack. "But Mom, your sister needs it more," Dad interrupted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "You're the responsible one, Emily. You'll figure something out." Figure something out. That had become their standard response to anything involving me. Need new clothes? Figure something out. Want to join the school trip to the art museum? Figure something out. Meanwhile, Sarah's room filled with new toys, new clothes, new everything, because she's been through so much. This manipulation was subtle but constant. If I expressed any frustration, I was being selfish. If I achieved something, it was quickly overshadowed by Sarah's smallest accomplishment. "Oh, you got straight A's? That's nice. But did you see Sarah's drawing? The doctor says it's remarkable for someone with her history." I learned to swallow my words, to push down the rising tide of resentment. But something else was growing inside me, a quiet, fierce determination. Every slight, every dismissal, every figure something out became fuel for my ambition. At night, after my shifts at Sugar Pines, I would sit in my room researching antiques and art history. Mrs. Martinez had introduced me to her brother, an antique dealer, and I spent my weekends learning about authentication techniques, market values, and the stories behind precious objects. While my family thought I was just working at a bakery, I was building the foundation of my future. The final straw came during my senior year. I had won a prestigious art history competition, earning a small scholarship. When I tried to share the news at dinner, Mom cut me off mid-sentence. "Sarah's teacher thinks she might have dyslexia," she announced, her voice trembling. "We'll need to get her tested. Emily, you'll have to work extra shifts to help with the costs." I looked at my sister, who was texting under the table, completely disengaged from the conversation about her own needs. Then at my parents, who had never once asked about my plans for the future. In that moment, something crystallized inside me, understanding that their love was conditional, and I would never meet those conditions. That night, I made a decision. I would go to Northwestern, with or without their help. I would build something of my own, something they couldn't dismiss or redistribute to Sarah. I would become so successful that their negligence would become their loss, not mine. What I didn't realize then was that success wouldn't free me from their manipulation. It would only change its form. Northwestern University felt like stepping into another world. My dorm room, small and cramped as it was, became the first space that was truly mine. No air purifiers humming in the background, no need to tiptoe around, no constant reminder of being the other daughter. The freedom was dizzying. I'd arrived with 2 suitcases and a box of carefully selected antique reference books I'd bought with my bakery savings. My roommate, Jessica, took one look at my worn clothes and outdated laptop and offered to loan me her spare MacBook. I declined. Every time someone offered help, I heard my father's voice. Figure something out. So I did. My first breakthrough came during an internship at Maxwell's Antiquities. I was cataloging a collection of Victorian jewelry when I noticed something others had missed, a distinctive maker's mark that significantly increased the piece's value. Mr. Maxwell, the owner, was impressed. "You have a gift, Emily," he said, studying me with keen eyes. Most people look at these pieces and see pretty trinkets. You see stories, histories, value. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Mr. Maxwell had said. All my life, I'd been trained to make myself smaller, to accept less, to give way. But here, in this new world of ancient treasures and hidden values, my attention to detail wasn't an inconvenience. It was an asset. I started taking extra courses in business and entrepreneurship while working at Maxwell's. Every penny I earned went into a separate account, my escape fund, though I didn't call it that yet. I learned about investment strategies, market analysis, and most importantly, how to recognize authenticity in both objects and people. The calls from home became predictable scripts. Mom would sigh about Sarah's latest crisis. Another dropped. Class, another failed attempt at finding her passion, another request for money. I'd listen, make sympathetic noises, and transfer whatever I could spare. But now, for the first time, I began to see the pattern. They never asked about my life, never wondered how I was managing college without their support, never questioned how I could afford to help with Sarah's expenses. It was as if they'd cast me in a role, the reliable daughter, the human ATM, and couldn't see beyond it. During my junior year, I discovered my true talent. authentication of rare pieces. I could spot a fake Tiffany lamp or a reproduced Victorian brooch with almost supernatural accuracy. My colleagues at Maxwell started calling me the authenticator. I kept this success quiet, letting my family believe I was still just scraping by with internship money. In the silence of my dorm room, I began planning. I researched business licenses, studied market trends, and built a network of contacts in the antiquities world. Every slight, every dismissal from my family became another brick in the foundation of what would become Elysian Relics. The name came to me one sleepless night. Elysian, meaning blessed, heavenly. Because that's what these objects were to me. Pieces of paradise, each with its own story of survival and worth, just like me. I learned to play the role my family expected, the dutiful daughter who lived a modest life, while secretly building an empire. Every time Sarah called asking for money for another new start, every time Mom hinted about their struggling mortgage, I added their words to my mental blueprint. They saw me as a safety net, never suspecting I was weaving something much larger. My own liberation. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that their reliable daughter, their perpetual backup plan, was methodically planning her own revelation. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because sometimes, I was learning, the quietest rebellions are the most powerful. The first office of Elysian Relics was barely bigger than my dorm room, a converted storage space in downtown Chicago, with water-stained ceiling tiles and temperamental heating. But it was mine. Every morning, as I turned the key in the lock, I felt a quiet thrill of victory. This small space represented everything I'd learned about value, how something overlooked could hold immense worth. My first major client came through a connection at Maxwell's. A wealthy collector needed authentication for a collection of Art Nouveau jewelry. I still remember standing in his climate-controlled vault, handling pieces worth more than my parents' house. My hands steady, despite my racing heart. When I identified two pieces as masterful reproductions, saving him from $1 million mistake, my reputation began to grow. "You've got a gift," he told me, writing a check that would become my company's first real capital. "You see what others miss." If only he knew how I'd developed that skill. Years of watching my parents' subtle dismissals, learning to read the unspoken messages in every sigh and sideways glance. I'd become an expert at authenticating not just objects, but intentions. The business grew quietly but steadily. I hired my first employee, then my second. Each success I celebrated alone, in my sparse apartment, with a single glass of champagne. Meanwhile, the calls from home continued their familiar pattern. "Emily, Sarah's thinking about trying photography now," Mom would say, her voice heavy with expectation. "The equipment is quite expensive." I'd transfer the money, but now it came from a separate account I'd set up specifically for family emergencies. Each transaction was carefully documented. Each request met with strategic precision. I was no longer just giving in. I was choosing to help on my own terms. My company's breakthrough came with the Ashworth estate. A collection of supposedly worthless Victorian trinkets turned out to contain several pieces from a renowned craftsman. The authentication made national news in the antiques world. Orders flooded in. I hired more specialists, moved to a larger office, and expanded our services. Still, I maintained my facade of modest success. When I visited home for holidays, I wore simple clothes and drove a reliable but unimpressive car. I listened to Sarah's endless plans for her next big venture, nodded at Dad's complaints about his teaching salary, and absorbed Mom's hints about their financial struggles. All while my company's value crossed into 8 figures. The real power wasn't in the money, it was in the choice. Every time I helped them, it was because I decided to, not because they forced my hand. I built my empire piece by piece, client by client, while they continued to see me as their reliable backup plan. In my new office, overlooking the Chicago skyline, I kept a small display case. Inside was the first piece I ever authenticated, a simple Victorian locket overlooked by other appraisers. Its true value wasn't in its gold content or even its maker's mark, but in what it represented: the power of seeing worth where others saw nothing. Each night, before leaving the office, I would look at that locket and remind myself of how far I'd come. From the girl who was sent away to protect her sister, to the woman who could now protect herself. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family's emotional neglect had given me the very skills that made me successful. Their dismissal had become my strength. What they still didn't understand was that while they saw me as a safety net, I had become a steel fortress. Every decision, every investment, every carefully maintained boundary was another brick in my wall of independence. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, on my own terms. The days following that fateful Christmas revelation were a blur of accusations and demands. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family members, each one more entitled than the last. But it was Sarah's Instagram post that finally made something snap inside me. Sometimes the people with the most refuse to help those who gave. Them everything, she wrote, accompanying a throwback photo of us as children. Family should come first. Disappointed Takard greed, Takard toxic sibling. I sat in my Chicago office, staring at those words on my screen. The irony of her hashtags made me laugh, a hollow, painful sound that startled even me. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city lights flickering like stars, each one representing someone's dream, someone's struggle, someone's story. My story was about to change. The next morning, I called a family meeting. Not at their house this time, but at a neutral location, a private room at a local restaurant. I arrived early, setting up my laptop and a series of folders. For the first time in my life, I was done being invisible. They arrived together, Mom, Dad, and Sarah, a united front against their ungrateful eldest daughter. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, Dad looked stern, and Sarah had that familiar pout she'd perfected over years of getting her way. "Before you say anything," I began, opening my laptop, "I want to show you something." I pulled up a spreadsheet. Every payment I'd made to them over the past 8 years. College tuition for Sarah's multiple attempted majors. Mortgage payments when they fell behind. Medical bills, car repairs, everything. "Over $500,000, I said quietly. "That's how much I've given this family while maintaining the illusion that I was just getting by. Every time Sarah wanted to try a new career path, every time the house needed repairs, every time there was a crisis, I was there, silently, without recognition, without thanks. But that's what family does," Mom interrupted, her voice trembling. "We help each other." When Sarah was sick. "I was 8, I cut in, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "I was 8 years old when you started teaching me that my needs would always come second, that I had to be quiet, be good, be invisible. You know what that does to a child?" Sarah scoffed. "Oh, please. You're just jealous because what, Sarah?" I turned to her. "Because you got everything while I got figure it out? Because every time you failed at something, I was expected to fund your next attempt? Did you know I worked 3 jobs in college while you were dropping out of your second university program?" Dad leaned forward, his teacher's authority voice in full effect. "Now listen here, young lady. No, you listen." I pulled out the folders. "These are records of every major milestone in my life that you missed because Sarah had a cold or a bad day or needed attention. My high school graduation, Sarah had a fever. My college graduation, Sarah was changing majors again and needed emotional support. My company's first major success, you were too busy helping Sarah move back home after another failed attempt at independence." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them processing the evidence before them, not just the money, but the years of systematic neglect documented in black and white. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, I continued, my voice softer now. I'm telling you because this dynamic ends today. I love you all, but I won't continue to be your emergency fund or your emotional cushion. My success isn't your safety net. It's the result of every time you told me to figure it out. And I did. Mom started crying, Dad looked away, and Sarah, for perhaps the first time in her life, was speechless. I closed my laptop, gathered my things, and stood up. I'll always be your daughter and your sister, I said, reaching for my coat. But from now on, it's on my terms. No more secret payments. No more guilt trips. No more pretending I'm less than I am to make others comfortable. I've spent my life authenticating valuable things. It's time I acknowledged my own worth. As I walked out of that restaurant, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of their expectations, their demands, their perpetual disappointment, it all fell away with each step. Sometimes I realized the biggest act of love is setting boundaries, even when it hurts. The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through my life like aftershocks from an earthquake. Sarah's social media campaign escalated. Carefully curated childhood photos accompanied by lengthy captions about family loyalty and sisterly betrayal. My parents took a different approach, alternating between guilt-laden silence and emotional manipulation through extended family members. Aunt Linda called first. "Your mother hasn't slept in days," she said, her voice heavy with accusation. "Is your success worth tearing your family apart?" I stood in my office, watching a rare spring, snow-dust Chicago's skyline. "The family was already torn apart," I replied calmly. "The only difference is that now we're acknowledging it." The calls kept coming. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions about my duties to family. Old family friends reached out with well-meaning but misguided advice about forgiveness and obligation. Each time, I remained steady in my response. I love my family, but this dynamic needed to change. At work, I threw myself into a major authentication project, a recently discovered collection of Art Deco jewelry that had surfaced in an old estate. As I examined each piece under my microscope, I couldn't help but see the parallels. Like these delicate artifacts, relationships too needed to be authenticated, their true nature brought to light. One evening, as I was locking up the office, my phone lit up with Sarah's name. My finger hovered over the decline button, but something made me answer. "I got fired again," she said, skipping any greeting. "No," I interrupted, my voice gentle but firm. "I know what you need, Sarah, but I'm not giving you money anymore." "I knew it," she spat. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me struggle while you sit in your fancy office with your millions?" I closed my eyes, feeling an old familiar pain, but this time it didn't overwhelm me. "I'm not enjoying your struggles, Sarah. But I'm no longer preventing you from facing them. There's a difference. Mom was right. Success has changed you." "No," I said, surprising myself with a small laugh. "Success didn't change me. It gave me the strength to stop pretending. There's a difference there too. After hanging up, I didn't feel the usual guilt or anxiety. Instead, I felt something new. Peace. I walked through the darkened office to my special display case, the one with the Victorian locket that started everything. Next to it, I'd recently added something new. A small framed photo of 8-year-old me, sitting alone on Grandma's porch the day I was first sent away. I touched the glass gently. "You figured it out," I whispered to that little girl. "You really did." The next few weeks brought more attempts at manipulation. Dad emailed about refinancing the house, attaching photos of Sarah and me as children. Mom left voicemails about family therapy, but only if I'd reconsider my position on financial support. Sarah's social media posts grew more desperate, now including screenshots of job rejections and past due bills. But something had shifted inside me. Each attempt at manipulation no longer felt like a knife to the heart. Instead, it was confirmation that I'd made the right choice. I began to see their behavior with new eyes, recognizing patterns I'd been too close to notice before. I hired a therapist, not for family counseling, but for myself. In her office, I began to unpack years of conditional love and emotional neglect. "You're not just setting boundaries," she told me during one session. "You're rewriting your own story." She was right. Each time I stood firm, each unanswered guilt trip text, each declined call for financial help, these weren't acts of cruelty as my family claimed. They were acts of self-respect, of finally giving myself the protection I'd never received. As a child, the snow outside my office window turned to spring rain, then summer sunshine. And through it all, I stood my ground. Not with anger or resentment, but with a calm certainty that I was finally doing the right thing. Not just for me, but for them too, even if they couldn't see it yet. I never expected truth to arrive in the form of George Henderson, my mother's childhood friend, sitting across from me in a quiet cafe 3 blocks from my office. His hands trembled slightly as he stirred his untouched coffee, the spoon making soft clicking sounds against the ceramic. "Your mother doesn't know I'm here," he began, his eyes fixed on the swirling liquid. "But after seeing all those social media posts, all that family drama, I couldn't stay silent anymore. You deserve to know the truth." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the same sensation I'd experienced countless times when bracing for another family disappointment. "What truth?" He reached into his weathered leather briefcase and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "I was your parents' accountant back then, before you were born. Before everything." He paused, running a hand through his gray hair. "Before the scandal." The word hung in the air between us. Scandal. It seemed impossible to associate that word with my modest, straight-laced parents, my physics teacher father and nurse mother, who lived their lives with such careful propriety. "Your parents weren't always the people you know," George continued, sliding the envelope across the table. "They were different once. Ambitious. Maybe too ambitious." With slightly trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside were bank statements, legal documents, and newspaper clippings from the local paper, all dated before my birth. As I read, the carefully constructed image of my childhood began to crack. The story emerged piece by piece. My parents had been involved in an investment scheme. They'd convinced friends and neighbors to invest in a fraudulent business venture, promising impossible returns. When it all collapsed, they were nearly $500,000 in debt, facing potential criminal charges. "They made a deal," George explained softly. "They agreed to pay everything back plus interest. The investors dropped the charges, but your parents, they lost everything. Their savings, their reputation, their dreams of running their own business." I stared at a photo from that time. My parents standing proudly in front of a small storefront, Mom's hair styled elegantly, Dad wearing a suit I'd never seen. They looked like different people, hungry people, ambitious people. "That's why they changed careers," George continued. "Your father went into teaching, your mother into nursing. They created this image of a simple, modest family life. It wasn't just about starting over. It was about hiding who they'd been." The pieces started falling into place. Their insistence on appearing modest, their discomfort with my success, their constant fear of attention or scrutiny. Even their treatment of me began to make a terrible kind of sense. "When I was born," I started. "You were their second chance," George nodded. "They were determined to raise you differently, to keep you from their mistakes. But then Sarah came along, premature and sick, and I think they saw her vulnerability as a kind of redemption." I looked down at my hands, seeing them with new eyes. The same hands that could authenticate priceless artifacts couldn't recognize the fabrication of my own family history. "Why tell me this now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. George finally met my eyes. Because I've watched you build something remarkable, Emily. Something honest and real. And I've watched them try to tear it down with the same old patterns of manipulation and secrets. You deserve to know why they are the way they are. Why they've treated you the way they have. I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of this new reality settle around me. All those years of being the responsible one, of being told to figure it out, of being pushed aside. They weren't just about Sarah's needs. They were about my parents' desperate attempt to ensure I never became like them, never reached too high, never risked too much. The irony was staggering. In trying to protect me from their past, they'd pushed me to create exactly what they'd lost, but I'd done it legitimately, ethically, successfully. Everything they'd failed to do, I'd accomplished. And now they couldn't bear to look at it. As I walked back to my office that afternoon, clutching the envelope of secrets, I felt both lighter and heavier. The truth had finally emerged, but with it came a new understanding that would change everything. Again. That night, I spread the contents of George's envelope across my dining room table, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my entire life. Each document told a part of the story I'd never known, the story that had shaped my entire existence without my knowledge. The local newspaper headline caught my eye. Local couple agrees to repayment plan in investment scandal. The photo showed my parents leaving the courthouse, heads bowed, my mother's hand protectively covering her stomach. Covering me, I realized with a start. I was already there, growing inside her, while their world was collapsing. I poured myself a glass of wine and started reading through their old bank statements. The numbers told a story of desperation. Accounts drained, loans taken out, assets liquidated. Everything they'd built, everything they'd dreamed of, disappeared in a matter of months. Is this why? I whispered to the empty room. Is this why you couldn't bear to see me succeed? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old family photos. There was Dad, teaching me to fish, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Mom, braiding my hair before school, always glancing over her shoulder as if waiting for disaster to strike. Every memory now held a double meaning, every interaction layered with hidden context. A particular photo made me pause, my high school graduation. I stood alone in my cap and gown, Sarah's fever having kept my parents away. But now I saw something different in my mother's excuse from that day. We can't risk drawing attention. Sarah needs us. Was she really worried about Sarah? Or was she afraid of running into their old investors at the ceremony? My laptop pinged with a new email from Sarah. Mom's crying again. Hope you're happy with yourself. I closed it without responding, understanding for the first time that Sarah wasn't just the favored child. She was their chance at redemption, their opportunity to prove they could protect someone from harm. Every time they chose her over me, they were really choosing their new selves over their past. I walked to my office, where that first Victorian locket still sat in its display case. I'd authenticated it when others had dismissed it as worthless, seeing value where they saw nothing. Now I realized I'd been doing the same thing my entire life, finding worth in myself when my own parents couldn't bear to look too closely. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd tried so hard to prevent me from following in their footsteps, from reaching too high or dreaming too big, that they'd never noticed I'd built something they couldn't. A legitimate empire based on authenticity and truth. My phone buzzed again. Dad this time. Your mother's not well. All this stress. Please, Emily, can't we go back to the way things were? The way things were. The careful facade, the comfortable lies, the structured denial. I set the phone down without responding and walked to my window, watching the city lights flicker below. Each light represented a story, a truth, a reality. Just like the antiques I authenticated, every story had its genuine elements and its fabrications. I thought about all the times I'd felt guilty for my success, all the moments I'd dimmed my own light to make them comfortable. I'd internalized their fear without even knowing its source. They'd turned their shame into my responsibility, their past failures into my present constraints. But understanding their motives didn't make their actions right. If anything, it made everything clearer. Their determined modesty, their insistence on staying small, their panic when I started to shine, it was all rooted in their own unresolved past. I picked up my phone and opened my notes app. It was time to write my own story, one that acknowledged both the pain and the triumph. Because sometimes understanding where you come from is the key to choosing where you're going. Dear Mom and Dad, I began typing. I know about the investment scandal. I know why you've spent my whole life afraid of success. The truth, I was learning, could be both a weapon and a healing balm. It all depended on how you chose to use it. I chose to meet them at their house this time. There was something fitting about confronting the past in the very place where so many truths had been buried. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the paint peeling on the porch steps. Steps I'd once helped Dad repaint every spring, before Sarah came along. Mom opened the door before I could knock. She'd aged somehow in the months since Christmas, the lines around her eyes deeper, her shoulders slightly stooped. Dad stood behind her, his physics teacher sweater vest a familiar armor against uncomfortable truths. Emily, Mom started. Reaching for a hug, I gently sidestepped. We've been so worried. Let's sit down, I interrupted, clutching my leather portfolio, the one containing George's documents. There's something we need to discuss. They exchanged a look I'd seen countless times growing up, the one that always preceded another excuse, another dismissal, another, Sarah needs us. But this time, I understood its deeper meaning, fear. In their modest living room with its carefully curated appearance of middle-class contentment, I opened my portfolio. Mom's sharp intake of breath when she saw the yellowed newspaper clipping told me everything. George Henderson came to see me, I said quietly, laying out the documents one by one. He told me about the investment scheme, about the debt, about why you changed your entire lives. Dad's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Emily, you don't understand. Actually, I understand everything now. I kept my voice steady, professional. The same tone I used when delivering difficult authentications to clients. I understand why you pushed me to be invisible, why you panic at any sign of ambition or success, why you turned Sarah's illness into a shield against the world. Mom started crying, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. We were trying to protect you. Protect me. I picked up one of the bank statements. Or protect yourselves. Every time I showed any sign of being too successful, too ambitious, you pushed me away, sent me to Grandma's, told me to figure it out. Was that protection? Or was it your own guilt? We didn't want you to make our mistakes. Dad burst out, his voice cracking. We lost everything because we reached too high, wanted too much. When Sarah came along, sick and vulnerable, you thought she was your redemption, I finished. A chance to prove you could protect someone from harm. But what about me, Dad? Who protected me? The silence that followed was heavy with decades of unspoken truths. Through the window, I could see our old tire swing, still hanging from the oak tree, another relic of the time before Sarah, before everything changed. Did you know, I continued, pulling out my company's latest financial report, that Elysian Relics has a higher ethical compliance rating than any other authentication firm in the Midwest? That we've helped expose 3 major fraud attempts in the past year alone? That every success I've built has been legitimate, transparent, and honest? They stared at the report, at the numbers that dwarfed their old debt, at the success they'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The daughter you tried to keep small built something bigger than your worst failure, I said softly. But instead of being proud, you tried to tear it down. Instead of seeing how I'd learned from your mistakes, You tried to make me repeat them by forcing me to enable Sarah's dependence. Mom reached for my hand across the coffee table. For the first time in my life, I saw something new in her eyes. Recognition. "We've been wrong," she whispered. "So wrong." "Yes," I agreed. "You have. But understanding why doesn't make it hurt any less. It doesn't erase the years of emotional neglect, the constant dismissal, the way you used Sarah's illness to control everyone around you." Dad started to speak, but I held up my hand. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here because you need to understand that your past doesn't justify what you did to me. And it definitely doesn't entitle you to my success." I stood up, gathering the documents but leaving the company report on their table. "I built Elysian Relics by doing everything you were too afraid to do. Taking ethical risks, embracing success, being visible. I'm not going to apologize for that anymore. And I'm not going to let your old fears dictate my future." As I walked to the door, Mom called out, "What happens now?" I turned back one last time, looking at these two people who had shaped my life with their fears. Now? Now you decide whether you want to be part of my story moving forward. But this time it'll be on my terms, with honesty, with boundaries, and without using Sarah as a shield. The screen door creaked shut behind me, a sound from my childhood that now seemed to mark the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. The truth once spoken has a way of changing everything it touches. In the days following my confrontation with our parents, Sarah showed up unannounced at my office. She looked smaller somehow, standing in my doorway, her usual confidence replaced by something I'd never seen in her before: uncertainty. "Is it true?" she asked, dropping into one of the leather client chairs. "About Mom and Dad? About what they did before we were born?" I studied my sister's face, seeing her clearly perhaps for the first time. She wasn't just the favored child anymore. She was another casualty of our parents' unresolved guilt, another player in their carefully constructed illusion of modest propriety. "Yes," I replied, opening my desk drawer and pulling out copies of the documents I'd made for exactly this moment. Everything they built their lives around, the modesty, the fear of attention, the obsession with keeping you dependent and me invisible, it all started here. Sarah's hands trembled as she read through the papers. I watched as realization dawned on her face, as pieces of our shared but drastically different childhoods began to make a new kind of sense. "All those times they kept me home," she whispered. "All those doctors, all those tests. Was it really about my health, or were they just overcompensating?" I finished. "Using your early health issues as an excuse to control everything and everyone around them, to prove they could protect someone, even if it meant destroying them in a different way." She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. "They made me weak, didn't they? All these years I thought I was special, needed extra care, but they just couldn't bear to let me fail or succeed on my own." I got up and walked to my window, giving her a moment to process. Below, Chicago's streets pulsed with life. People rushing to meetings, chasing dreams, facing their own truths. "You know what's ironic?" I said, turning back to her. "Every time I succeeded at something, they pushed me away. Every time you struggled with something, they pulled you closer. They were so afraid of their past that they turned us into opposing symbols. Me of everything they feared, you of everything they wanted to protect." Sarah wiped her eyes, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "I posted such horrible things about you on social media. I called you selfish, cruel. But all this time, you were the only one being honest. We were both playing roles they assigned us," I said softly. "You were the vulnerable one who needed protection. I was the strong one who had to figure it out. Neither role was fair to either of us." She stood up suddenly, pacing my office with nervous energy. "I don't know who I am without their protection. I don't know how to How to just be Sarah. I know, I replied, thinking of my own journey. It's terrifying to step out of the role you've been assigned, but it's also liberating. Sarah stopped at my display case, looking at the Victorian locket that started everything. How did you do it? How did you build all this while carrying their fear, their disapproval? I learned to authenticate things, I said, joining her at the case. To tell what's real from what's fake. Eventually, I applied that skill to myself, to our family dynamics. The truth might be painful, but it's always valuable. She turned to me then, looking more like my sister than she had in years. Will you help me learn who I am without their protection? Without the constant drama and dependency? I felt something shift between us, the old patterns of resentment and competition giving way to something new, something real. Yes, I said, but not by giving you money or solving your problems. I'll help you by being honest with you, by supporting you while you learn to stand on your own. Sarah nodded, then did something she hadn't done since we were children. She hugged me. As I held my sister, I could feel her shaking with sobs, years of carefully maintained facades crumbling away. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for everything. I know, I replied, and for the first time I truly did. We were both victims of our parents' past, both shaped by fears we hadn't known existed. But now, with the truth laid bare, we had a chance to rewrite our roles, to find out who we really were beyond the family script. As Sarah left my office that day, I saw something new in her walk. A slight straightening of her shoulders, a tiny step toward independence. Sometimes I realized, the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to find their own strength. The first family dinner after everything came to light was held in my apartment. I chose the location deliberately. No more hiding my success, no more pretending to be less than I was. The Chicago skyline stretched out beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering testament to how far I'd come. Mom arrived first, clutching a casserole dish like a shield. She paused in my entryway, taking in the art on my walls, the antique, furniture, the subtle signs of wealth I'd hidden from them for so long. "This is beautiful, Emily," she said softly, and for the first time in years, I heard genuine appreciation in her voice instead of fear or judgment. Dad came next. Then, Sarah. We gathered around my dining table, a restored Victorian piece I'd authenticated and fallen in love with. The silence was uncomfortable at first, heavy with unspoken words and shifting dynamics. "I've been seeing a therapist," Sarah announced suddenly, breaking the tension. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. "She's helping me understand how dependent I've become, how afraid I've been to really try anything." Dad started to speak, probably to offer to pay for the therapy, but caught himself. I saw the effort it took him to stay silent, to not fall back into old patterns. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Sarah continued. "But this time, I want to do it differently. I want to study art authentication, like Emily. Not because I want to copy her," she added quickly, looking at me, "but because when she showed me those documents, when she explained how she knew they were real, something clicked. For the first time, I felt genuinely interested in something, not just trying something new to please everyone else." Mom's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. We never meant to make you so dependent, Sarah. Or you so distant, Emily. We were just so afraid. Afraid of becoming those people again," Dad finished, meeting my eyes across the table. "The ones who lost everything because we wanted too much. But in trying to protect you both from our mistakes, we made different ones." I took a sip of wine, letting their words settle in the air. "You know what the key to authentication is?" I asked, looking at each of them. "Understanding that every piece tells two stories. Its surface story, the the one everyone can see, and its true story, the one you have to look deeper to find. Our family has been living a surface story for too long. How do we change that? Mom asked, and the vulnerability in her voice made her sound younger, more real. We start with honesty, I replied. Real honesty, not just about the past, but about who we are now. All of us. Sarah straightened in her chair. I've withdrawn from my social media accounts, she said. I realized I was using them the way we used my health issues growing up, to manipulate, to get attention, to avoid facing reality. Dad nodded slowly. I've been thinking about retiring from teaching, not to start a business, he added quickly, but because I've been hiding behind that job, using it as proof that I'd changed, that I wasn't that ambitious person anymore. But maybe there's a middle ground between reckless ambition and complete surrender. There is, I said, standing to walk to my display case. I brought back the Victorian locket, placing it in the center of the table. This piece taught me something important. It had been dismissed as worthless because someone once declared it a fake. But when I looked deeper, I found its true value. People are like that too. We're not just our past mistakes or our present successes. We're everything in between. Mom reached out tentatively and touched the locket. I used to wear something similar before everything happened. I got rid of all my nice things, thinking that would prove I'd changed. But changing isn't about making yourself smaller, I said gently. It's about growing in a better direction. We talked late into the night, really talked, perhaps for the first time in our lives. There were tears, uncomfortable silences, moments of defensive anger followed by genuine apologies. It wasn't perfect. Healing rarely is. But it was real. As they were leaving, Sarah hung back. Thank you, she whispered, hugging me. Not for the money or the help I used to always ask for, but for this, for showing me what real strength looks like. I watched them leave from my window, Mom and Dad walking closer together than they had in years, Sarah standing straighter, all of them moving differently under the weight of truth and the lightness of honesty. The city lights flickered. Below, each one a story, each one a truth waiting to be discovered. Our family's truth had finally emerged from the shadows, and though it had been painful, it had also set us free to become something new, something authentic. 6 months passed, each day bringing small but significant changes in our family dynamic. Sarah enrolled in a certification program for art authentication, paying her own way by working part-time at a local gallery. She called me sometimes with questions about the coursework. And for the first time in our lives, we were building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than dependency. Mom and Dad started marriage counseling, finally confronting the fears and guilt that had shaped our family for so long. Dad retired from teaching but didn't retreat. Instead, he began volunteering at a local museum, sharing his love of physics through educational programs for children. Mom started gardening, something she'd given up when Sarah was born, gradually allowing herself small pleasures without guilt. I watched these changes from a careful distance, maintaining boundaries while leaving room for growth. When Sarah called to celebrate getting an A on her first authentication project, I heard genuine pride in her voice, not the manufactured drama of her past achievements. I actually understood it, Emmy, she said excitedly. The piece was this Art Deco brooch, and I could see the tells you taught me about, the wear patterns, the maker's mark placement. It felt real. Real. That word had taken on new meaning for all of us. One Sunday afternoon, Mom called, not with a crisis or a guilt trip, but with a question. Could you teach me about what you do? Not the technical parts, just I'd like to understand your world better. So I invited her to my office after hours. We sat together at my authentication desk, and I showed her how to use a loop, how to feel the weight of genuine silver versus plated, how to read the story each piece tells. She was tentative at first, then increasingly curious. I used to love beautiful things, she admitted quietly. Before everything happened. Then I thought wanting beauty made me greedy. Beauty isn't greed, Mom, I said, placing a delicate Victorian bracelet in her hands. It's appreciation. There's a difference. Dad found his own way to bridge our gap. He started sending me articles about the physics of metal aging, the scientific principles behind authentication techniques. Not to prove anything, just to share something he loved with something I loved. The most profound change was in Sarah. She deleted her old social media accounts and started fresh, posting about her studies, her genuine interests. No more manipulation, no more dramatic pleas for attention. She was learning to stand on her own, and though she stumbled sometimes, she never asked me to catch her, only to listen. During this time, Elysian relics continued to grow. But now, when I achieved something significant, I didn't hide it. I shared it, not out of pride or defiance, but as part of my truth. And slowly, my family learned to celebrate these successes without fear. We were learning a new language of family, one built on authenticity rather than avoidance, on truth rather than fear. Like the pieces I authenticated, we were discovering our own genuine marks, our own true patterns of being. 1 year after that fateful Christmas revelation, I stood in my expanded office space at Elysian Relics, preparing for a special event. The display cases gleamed under carefully positioned lights, each containing pieces that told stories of authenticity and value. But tonight's most important piece sat in a central case, the Victorian locket that had started everything. My family would be arriving soon for the official opening of our new educational wing, a space dedicated to teaching authentication techniques and the value of genuine artifacts. Sarah would be among the first students, now in her final month of certification. I adjusted my blazer and caught my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me wasn't hiding anymore, wasn't dimming her light to make others comfortable. She had found her own authenticity. The elevator dinged, and they arrived, Mom, Dad, and Sarah, but so different from a year ago. Mom wore a vintage brooch she'd recently bought herself, no longer afraid of showing appreciation for beautiful things. Dad carried a folder of his museum programs, proud of finding his own path after retirement. And Sarah? Sarah walked with a confidence that came from within, not from others' attention. "The place looks amazing, Emmy," Sarah said, hugging me. No manipulation in her voice, no hidden agenda. Just genuine pride from a sister who had learned to stand on her own. Mom touched the central display case gently. "Is this the famous locket?" "It is," I replied. "I'm using it as part of my opening speech tonight, about how sometimes the most valuable things are the ones that teach us to recognize our own worth." Dad cleared his throat. "We have something for you," he said, pulling out a small package. We found it while cleaning out the attic. Inside was a faded photograph I'd never seen before. Me at 8 years old, sitting at my little desk, completely absorbed in examining some trinket or other. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, Emily, always seeing the value in things. "We didn't understand then," Mom said softly, "but you were always authentically yourself." We were the ones wearing masks. The guests would be arriving soon. Colleagues, clients, students eager to learn. But in that moment, standing with my family, I felt the weight of our journey. We had all been transformed, not by running from the past, but by finally facing it. "I'd like to change the name of this wing," I said suddenly. "Instead of the Elysian Educational Center, I want to call it the Henderson Authentication Institute." They looked at me questioningly. "After George?" Dad asked, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Yes," I nodded. "Because sometimes the most valuable gift you can give someone is the truth. Even when it's difficult. Even when it hurts. Sarah squeezed my hand. Truth and authenticity, she said. That's what you've taught all of us. As the first guests began to arrive, I looked at my family, imperfect, healing, genuine. We had all learned to authenticate ourselves, to distinguish between the real and the artificial in our relationships. Like the pieces in my collection, we had emerged from the test of fire with our true marks revealed. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. In the end, we had all discovered the same truth, that real value, like real love, can withstand the closest examination. And that sometimes the most precious things are not the ones that shine the brightest, but the ones that remain genuine, no matter how closely you look. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Give it a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.